It was a hot summer afternoon, the kind where the sun seemed to hang in the sky just a little too long. The Johnson family was gathered in their backyard, the familiar smells of charcoal and BBQ sauce filling the air. The hum of laughter and conversation blended with the sizzling of burgers on the grill, creating the perfect soundtrack for a day of relaxation. Terrence Johnson, a tall, broad-shouldered man in his early 40s, stood at the grill, flipping burgers with practiced ease. His wife, Angela, was nearby, setting up a pitcher of lemonade on the picnic table, while their 8-year-old daughter, Ava, raced around the yard with her cousins. The Johnsons were known in the neighborhood for their warmth and hospitality. Today was no different. They had invited a few neighbors over for a casual get-together, a mix of family and friends who lived nearby. Children ran through the sprinklers, squealing with delight, while the adults chatted and enjoyed the music softly playing from a speaker on the porch. It was the kind of peaceful, easygoing afternoon that made the world feel right, if only for a little while. But not everyone in the neighborhood shared the same joy. Across the street, hidden behind the white wooden porch of his house, sat Bill Thompson. In his mid-60s, Bill was a relic of a different time, a man whose views on race and community had not evolved with the world around him. As he sat in his rocking chair, sipping on a beer, his eyes were locked on the Johnsons' backyard. The sight of the Black family hosting a BBQ, with their laughter and joy spilling into the air, only stoked the bitterness that simmered within him. Bill's face twisted in disgust as he watched the scene. "Ruiners," he muttered to himself, his voice low and gravelly. He took another swig from his beer, the cold liquid doing little to cool the fire of hate burning inside him. His eyes narrowed as he spotted Ava chasing her cousin through the yard, her bright, innocent laughter ringing out. "Look at them, just acting like they belong here," he spat, setting his beer down with a thud. The Johnsons had been living in the neighborhood for about 2 years now, and while most of the neighbors had come to welcome them, Bill had never hidden his disdain. He had grown up in a time when people knew their place. As he liked to say, and seeing a Black family living so freely in what he considered his neighborhood gnawed at him every day. But what truly set Bill apart was something no one knew. Bill wasn't just a bigot, he was a member of a small, secretive KKK chapter that still operated in the shadows of this suburban town. As he sat there stewing in his anger, Bill's thoughts turned dark. "How dare they," he muttered. "These people think they can just take over." He stood up from his chair, the motion sharp and sudden, as if the very act of standing gave him purpose. "Not on my watch." Across the street, Terrence wiped his hands on a towel and turned to Angela with a smile. "Burgers are almost done," he said, his voice warm and full of the day's easy happiness. Angela smiled back, setting down a tray of buns on the table. "Perfect timing," she replied, glancing over at Ava, who was now helping one of her younger cousins climb onto the swing. "Look at her," Angela said softly, pride evident in her voice. "She's growing up so fast." Terrence nodded, following her gaze. Ava was the kind of kid who made friends easily, bright, compassionate, and full of curiosity. She was the heart of their family, always ready with a question about the world or a kind word to lift someone's spirits. Watching her now, Terrence felt a swell of pride. He had worked hard to provide a good life for his family, and moments like these made it all feel worth it. But as the Johnson family enjoyed their afternoon, the atmosphere across the street grew darker. Bill paced back and forth on his porch, his anger building with every second. He couldn't stand the sight of them any longer. He had heard enough of their laughter, seen enough of their happiness. In his mind, they were trespassers in a world that didn't belong to them. With a hard set to his jaw, Bill marched back into his house. His hands shook with rage as he grabbed his worn-out Confederate flag hat and shoved it on his head. He glanced at himself in the mirror by the door, his old, weathered face staring back at him, eyes filled with hate. He turned and stormed out of his house, slamming the door behind him. Bill crossed the street with purpose, his boots thudding against the pavement, fists clenched at his sides. His eyes were locked on the Johnsons' backyard, where Terrence had just set the burgers on a tray, unaware of the storm that was heading their way. Terrence set the burgers down on the table, his face beaming with pride as he called out to everyone. "All right, why all? The food's ready. Come grab a plate." His voice carried over the sound of the children's laughter and the soft music playing in the background. Ava ran up to the table, her eyes lighting up at the sight of the food. "Dad, can I have mine with just ketchup?" she asked eagerly, her small hands already reaching for a bun. "You got it, sweetheart," Terrence said, smiling as he squirted a generous line of ketchup across the burger patty and handed it to her. Angela watched their daughter with a smile, shaking her head fondly. Everything about this day felt perfect: family, friends, and the simple joys of a backyard BBQ. But as they all began to dig into their food, the peaceful atmosphere was about to be shattered. A loud, angry voice cut through the air like a knife. "You people think you can just do whatever you want, huh?" The entire backyard fell silent as all eyes turned toward the source of the voice. Bill Thompson stood at the edge of the yard, his face twisted with anger, his fists balled at his sides. He was breathing heavily, his eyes darting from one face to the next, his rage palpable. The Confederate hat on his head and the sneer on his lips told everyone exactly what kind of man they were dealing with. Terrence, his smile fading, stepped forward, his brow furrowing in confusion and concern. "Can I help you, Bill?" he asked, trying to keep his tone calm, though he could feel the tension already rising in his chest. Bill took another step closer, his boots sinking into the grass. He jabbed a finger toward Terrence, his voice rising with every word. "I don't know who you think you are, throwing these damn cookouts in our neighborhood like you own the place. But let me tell you something, you don't belong here." Angela quickly moved to stand beside her husband, her expression tightening with a mix of fear and anger. The other guests, some family and a few neighbors, looked on in stunned silence, unsure of how to react. The children, sensing the sudden change in mood, huddled closer to their parents, confused and a little frightened. Terrence's face remained calm, but inside his heart was pounding. He had dealt with racism before being a black man in America. It was an unfortunate reality. But this was different. This was his home, his family. And Bill was standing there, spewing hatred in front of his wife, his daughter, and everyone else who had come to enjoy the day. "Bill," Terrence began, his voice firm but measured, "I think you need to leave. We're just out here enjoying a BBQ with family and friends. There's no need for this." Bill's face contorted in disgust. "Family and friends, huh?" he spat, looking around at the people gathered. "This ain't your family. This ain't your neighborhood. People like you don't belong here. You never did, and you never will." Angela's hand tightened around Terrence's arm, and she whispered, "Let's just get him out of here before it escalates," but Terrence could feel his patience slipping. The man had crossed the line, and every part of him wanted to stand up and fight back. But he couldn't lose control, not in front of Ava, and not here. Before Terrence could respond, Ava, who had been standing close by, holding her burger with wide eyes, stepped forward. "Why are you so mad, Mr.?" she asked, her voice small but steady. The entire yard seemed to hold its breath as the little girl's words hung in the air. Bill turned his gaze to Ava, his face hardening. "Why am I mad?" he repeated, his voice dripping with venom. "Because people like you think you can just take over everything. You think you can come into our neighborhoods, live your lives like you're one of us, but you never will be." Ava blinked up at him, unfazed by his anger. "My daddy says people who are mean are just scared," she said, her innocent voice cutting through the tension like a sharp blade. "Are you scared of us?" Bill froze, his face twitching as if he had been slapped. For a moment he didn't know how to respond. The simple honesty in Ava's question left him speechless. Around them, the other adults remained still, eyes darting between Bill and Ava, waiting for what would come next. Bill, regaining his composure, growled, "You don't know what you're talking about, little girl," but his voice was less certain now, as if Ava's words had struck a nerve he wasn't prepared to deal with. Ava tilted her head slightly, her curiosity piqued. "My mom says love is stronger than hate," she continued, her eyes never leaving Bill's face. "You don't have to be mean to us. We can all live here together. My dad says it's a free country." Bill's hands shook at his sides, his face turning a deep red. He opened his mouth to snap back at her, but the words wouldn't come. It was as if Ava's simple, straightforward innocence had rendered him powerless. What could he say to that? How do you fight the truth when it comes from the mouth of a child? Terrence stepped forward again, standing beside Ava. "You heard her," he said quietly but firmly. "This is our home, Bill. Just like it's yours, we have the right to be here, and nothing you say is going to change that." Bill stood there, glaring at Terrence and Ava, but something had shifted. The anger in his eyes was still there, but it was tempered now by something else, something he wasn't ready to face. His hands dropped to his sides, his body sagging as if the fight had drained out of him. "You just remember," Bill muttered, his voice low and shaky. "This neighborhood used to be different. It used to be better." He turned on his heel and stomped away, crossing back to his house without looking back. The tension in the yard slowly began to dissolve as everyone exhaled, the weight of the confrontation lifting. Angela knelt down beside Ava, pulling her into a tight hug. "You were so brave," she whispered, kissing her daughter's forehead. Terrence placed a hand on Ava's shoulder, his eyes filled with pride and emotion. "You did good, baby girl," he said softly. "You did real good." The other guests began to murmur, some expressing their shock, others praising Ava for standing up to Bill. But for the Johnson family, the moment felt bigger than just a neighborhood squabble. It was a reminder of the strength they had as a family and the power that even the smallest voice could have in the face of hatred. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a warm golden hue over the neighborhood, the tension from Bill's outburst lingered like a thick cloud. The Johnson family tried to regain their composure, but the energy had shifted. What had been a peaceful and joyful afternoon was now tainted by the ugliness of Bill's intrusion. Ava, though praised for her bravery, seemed quieter than usual, her big brown eyes lost in thought as she sat on the swing, gently rocking back and forth. Terrence and Angela exchanged a glance as they cleaned up the plates and cups left behind from lunch. Both could feel the weight of what had just happened pressing on their hearts. Terrence wiped his hands on a towel, then leaned against the side of the house, staring out at the street where Bill had retreated. "Are you okay?" Angela asked softly, coming to stand beside him. Terrence nodded, but his jaw was clenched. "I'm fine," he replied, though the tightness in his voice said otherwise. He had been holding back so much during that confrontation. He didn't want to make a scene, didn't want to give Bill the satisfaction of seeing him angry. But inside he had been furious. How could that man in this day and age still hold on to so much hate? And more than that, how dare he come onto their property and attack them like that? Angela reached out and placed a hand on his arm. "I know what you're thinking," she said quietly, "but you did the right thing. You kept calm. Ava was watching, and you showed her how to handle a situation like that with dignity." Terrence sighed, his shoulders sagging a little. "I know, it's just, I hate that she even had to witness something like that. She's only 8, Ange. She shouldn't have to understand what people like Bill think about us. Not yet." Angela squeezed his arm gently. "I hate it too. But she did good today. She stood up to him in a way that even I don't think I could have. Maybe we've raised her stronger than we realize." Terrence glanced over at Ava, still sitting quietly on the swing. His heart ached a little, knowing that moments like this were shaping her view of the world. She had stood up to Bill, yes, but how much of that hatred had she absorbed? How much had that ugly confrontation chipped away at her innocence? "I just want her to be able to be a kid, you know," Terrence said, his voice heavy with emotion. "I don't want her growing up too fast because of stuff like this." Angela nodded, her own heart aching in the same way. "I know. But she's strong. And she's going to be okay, we all are." Across the yard, one of their neighbors, Susan, approached, her face etched with concern. She had been one of the few who had stayed behind after Bill's outburst, clearly unsettled by what had happened. Susan had moved into the neighborhood a year after the Johnsons and had always been friendly, though not close with them. "Hey," Susan said softly as she reached them. "I just wanted to check in. I'm so sorry about what happened earlier. I had no idea Bill was like that. It's awful. I don't even know what to say." Terrence forced a smile, appreciating the gesture but feeling weary from it all. "Thanks, Susan. It's not your fault. We've dealt with people like Bill before." Susan looked down at her feet, her hands wringing nervously. I wish I would have said something sooner, you know. When he started yelling, I froze. And then your daughter. God, she was braver than any of us." Angela smiled softly. "She's something, isn't she?" Susan nodded, but her expression remained troubled. "She is. And what she said about people being scared, it really hit me. I think a lot of us, we don't say anything because we're scared. Not scared of people like Bill, but scared of doing the wrong thing, scared of making it worse." Terrence studied Susan for a moment, his frustration softening as he realized that she too was grappling with her own role in the situation. He had been so focused on protecting his family that he hadn't considered how some of the other neighbors might be feeling. It's not easy, Terrence said finally. I get that. But people like Bill, they thrive on our silence. When no one speaks up, it gives them power. And that's how things like this keep happening. Susan nodded slowly, her face thoughtful. You're right. I just wish I had been braver. Angela gave her a reassuring smile. You're here now. And that counts for something. As Susan walked back to join her husband, who was watching their kids play on the lawn, Terrence turned his attention back to Ava. She was still on the swing, but now she was looking up at the sky, her face calm but reflective. He walked over to her and knelt down beside the swing. Hey kiddo, he said gently, you doing okay? Ava nodded, her eyes still focused on the clouds. Yeah, I'm okay. Terrence didn't press her. He knew his daughter well enough to understand that she processed things in her own time. But he didn't want to leave her alone with her thoughts for too long. You were really brave today, he said after a moment. I'm proud of you. Ava finally looked at him, her big brown eyes filled with a wisdom beyond her years. Why was that man so mad at us, Daddy? We didn't do anything wrong. Terrence felt a lump form in his throat. How could he explain something so complex, so ugly, to his little girl? He took a deep breath and sat down on the grass beside her, leaning his back against the tree. You're right, Ava, he said. We didn't do anything wrong. Sometimes, though, people are mad or mean because they're afraid. They don't understand other people who are different from them, and instead of trying to learn, they just hold on to their fear. That man, Bill, he's afraid of change. He's afraid of people like us because we're different from what he's used to. But that doesn't mean he's right. Ava listened quietly, her small face serious. But why does he have to be so mean, she asked, her voice tinged with sadness. If he's scared, can't we just be nice to him and show him we're not scary? Terrence smiled sadly. Sometimes that works, sweetie. And sometimes people like Bill don't want to see the truth, no matter how nice you are to them. They hold on to their anger because it's easier than letting go of their fear. But you did something really special today. You made him stop and think. And maybe, just maybe, that will change something in him. Ava nodded, though Terrence could see she was still grappling with the idea. Do you think he'll stop being mean now? I don't know, Ava, Terrence admitted. But what I do know is that you made a difference today. You showed him that you're not afraid of him, and you stood up for what's right. And that's something to be proud of. Ava smiled softly, the weight on her little shoulders seeming to lift just a bit. Okay, Daddy, I'm proud of me too. Terrence chuckled and ruffled her hair. Good. Now, how about we go get some of that dessert your mom made? Ava's face lit up at the mention of dessert, and she hopped off the swing, racing toward the picnic table. Terrence watched her go, his heart full of love and pride. But as he stood up and walked back to rejoin the party, a nagging thought remained in the back of his mind: would Bill come back? Would this really be the end of it? For now, though, he pushed those worries aside. His daughter was safe, his family was together, and for the moment, that was enough. The sun had nearly set, casting long shadows across the yard as the BBQ wound down. Some of the neighbors had left, offering apologetic glances and quiet words of support as they went. The Johnson family stayed behind, gathering the last of the plates and folding chairs. Ava was still playing with her cousins, their laughter slowly returning to the air, as if trying to erase the earlier tension. Terrence and Angela worked quietly, their earlier conversation still fresh in their minds. But as they packed up, Terrence's eyes kept darting across the street, his instincts on edge. He had hoped Bill's outburst would be the end of it. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. Angela noticed her husband's unease. You think he's going to come back, don't you? She asked, her voice low so the kids wouldn't hear. Terrence hesitated before answering. I don't know. People like Bill don't let things go that easy. And I'm not going to lie, I've got a bad feeling about this. Angela looked across the street, where Bill's house sat quiet and dark. Maybe we should call the police, she suggested, just in case. Terrence shook his head, though the thought had crossed his mind. What are we going to tell them? That the neighborhood racist got mad at us for having a BBQ. They'll just say it's a neighborly dispute and leave it at that. Besides, calling the cops could just make things worse. Angela bit her lip, knowing he was probably right. But still, the fear gnawed at her. I don't want anything to happen to Ava, she whispered, her voice breaking slightly. Terrence wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close. Nothing's going to happen to her, he said firmly. I won't let it. Just as they were about to finish cleaning up, the sound of heavy boots on pavement reached their ears. Terrence turned around, his stomach sinking. Bill was coming back. This time he wasn't alone. Walking beside him were two men Terrence didn't recognize, both large, burly figures with hard expressions. They wore dark jackets and jeans, their postures tense as they approached the Johnsons' yard. Bill, now emboldened by the presence of his friends, looked even angrier than before. Terrence's pulse quickened, but he forced himself to stay calm. He stepped in front of Angela, shielding her from whatever was about to happen. Bill stopped at the edge of the yard again, this time with a cruel smirk on his face. I told you earlier this ain't your neighborhood, he sneered, his voice dripping with malice. But it looks like you didn't get the message. Terrence took a deep breath, his fists clenched at his sides. Bill, I'm telling you again, you need to leave. This is our home, and we're not going anywhere. One of Bill's companions, a large man with a shaved head, snickered. You think you can just talk to us like that, he said, his voice low and threatening. You got a lot of nerve, boy. Angela stepped forward, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. We don't want any trouble. Just leave us alone. Bill's face twisted into an ugly grin. Trouble? You think we're the ones causing trouble? You're the ones who don't belong here. Terrence's mind raced, his heart pounding as he tried to figure out how to de-escalate the situation. The last thing he wanted was a physical confrontation, but Bill and his friends looked ready for a fight. And while Terrence was strong, he wasn't sure he could take on 3 men if things got violent. Ava, sensing the rising tension, had stopped playing and was watching from the porch. Her wide eyes flicked between her father and the men, standing at the edge of the yard, confusion and fear written all over her face. Terrence saw her and immediately felt a surge of protective instinct. He couldn't let this escalate, not in front of his daughter. I'm not looking for a fight, Terrence said, his voice calm but firm. But if you want one, you're not going to find it here. Just go home, Bill. This doesn't have to get ugly. Bill's grin widened. Oh, I think it does, he said, taking a step forward. See, I don't like being disrespected. And you and your little family, you've been disrespecting this neighborhood since the day you moved in. Terrence opened his mouth to respond, but before he could say anything, Ava's voice cut through the air. You need to stop being mean. The words were simple, but they hit like a thunderbolt. Everyone turned to look at Avia, who had stepped off the porch and was now standing with her hands on her hips, staring down Bill and his friends with a look of pure defiance. Bill blinked, momentarily thrown off by the little girl's boldness. What did you say, he asked, his voice wavering slightly. Ava didn't flinch. I said you need to stop being mean, she repeated, her voice steady and clear. We didn't do anything to you. You're just mad because we're different. But that's not a good reason to hurt people. For a brief moment, silence hung in the air. Bill and his friends seemed unsure of how to respond. It was as if the innocence in Ava's words had disarmed them, leaving them momentarily powerless. But then, Bill's face hardened again. You don't know anything, Kitty growled. You think this is about being different? This is about people like you thinking you can take over everything. Ava, undeterred, took a small step forward. You're just scared, she said quietly. My daddy says people who hurt others are just scared. You're scared of us because we're different, but we're not scary. You don't have to hate us. Bill's eyes flickered with something, maybe anger, maybe doubt, but whatever it was, it shook him. His face contorted as he tried to maintain his tough exterior, but Ava's words had clearly struck a nerve. He took a shaky step back, his confidence faltering for the first time. Terrence watched in awe as his daughter stood her ground, speaking with a courage far beyond her years. He could see the confusion in Bill's eyes, the internal struggle playing out on his face. The hatred that had fueled him all this time was being challenged by something he couldn't understand, something that a little girl had awakened with just a few simple words. One of Bill's friends, the man with the shaved head, glanced nervously at Bill. Come on, man, he muttered. Let's get out of here. This ain't worth it. Bill shot him a glare, but he could feel his grip on the situation slipping. The crowd of onlookers' neighbors who had been watching from their porches and windows was growing, and the weight of their silent judgment pressed down on him. For a moment, Bill looked like he might lash out again, but then he sighed heavily, the fight draining out of him. Without another word, he turned and stomped back toward his house, his friends trailing behind him. The three men disappeared into the growing darkness, their bravado shattered. As they left, the neighborhood seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. The tension that had been building for hours finally broke, and the quiet returned, leaving only the sound of crickets chirping in the distance. Terrence knelt down beside Ava, pulling her into a tight hug. "You were amazing," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You stopped him." Ava smiled, a little shy now that the moment had passed. "I just told him the truth," she said softly. Angela joined them, her eyes brimming with tears as she hugged her daughter. "You're so brave," she whispered. "We're so proud of you." As they stood there, wrapped in the warmth of their family, the remaining neighbors began to gather around, offering words of support and solidarity. The fear that had once gripped the Johnsons' yard was replaced with something stronger, something that could overcome even the deepest hatred. And as the last light of the sun dipped below the horizon, Terrence knew that no matter what came next, they would face it together. As Bill and his friends disappeared into the night, the Johnson family stood together, holding on to one another tightly. The backyard, once filled with joy and laughter, had become the setting of something much heavier. Though the immediate danger had passed, the weight of what had just occurred lingered in the air. The neighbors who had stayed behind began to approach the family, offering words of support and comfort. Susan, the neighbor who had earlier apologized for not standing up sooner, was the first to step forward. Her face was still pale with shock, but her eyes were filled with determination. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I should have done more. We all should have." Terrence looked at her, appreciating the gesture but feeling the exhaustion of the day settle into his bones. He was grateful for the support, but right now all he wanted was for his family to feel safe again. "It's not your fault, Susan," he said, his voice calm but tired. "You were here when it mattered." Angela, standing next to him with her arm wrapped around Ava, nodded in agreement. "Thank you," she said softly. "We appreciate it, really." Around them, more neighbors began to gather, offering kind words and hugs. David, a white man in his late 50s who lived a few houses down, stepped forward and shook Terrence's hand. "We're with you," David said firmly. "What Bill did was wrong. He doesn't speak for us." Terrence nodded, his heart warmed by the show of solidarity. "I appreciate that," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It means a lot to know we're not alone." But as the neighbors continued to offer their support, Terrence couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. He knew this wasn't over. Bill might have retreated for now, but people like him didn't just give up. The fact that Bill had brought friends with him tonight only confirmed what Terrence had feared. This was a deeper, more organized hatred, one that wouldn't go away with just a few kind words. Angela seemed to sense what he was feeling. "Do you think he'll come back?" she asked quietly, her eyes flicking nervously toward the darkened street. Terrence hesitated, not wanting to alarm her but knowing he couldn't lie. "I don't know," he admitted, "but we'll be ready if he does." Angela looked over at Ava, who was still wrapped in her arms. She sighed softly, brushing a strand of hair away from Ava's face. "I just don't want her to have to go through this again." "We'll protect her," Terrence said, his voice firm with resolve. "No matter what." Ava, who had been quiet for most of the exchange, looked up at her parents with wide eyes. "Daddy, do you think Mr. Bill will be nice now?" she asked, her voice small but hopeful. Terrence's heart ached at the innocence of her question. How could he explain to her that the world wasn't always that simple? That sometimes people didn't change just because they had been called out? He knelt down beside her, meeting her eyes. "I don't know, baby girl," he said gently. "But what I do know is that you were really brave tonight. You made him stop and think, and that's more than a lot of grown-ups could do." Ava smiled, her face lighting up with pride. "I just wanted him to stop being mean." "You did good," Angela said, hugging her daughter close. "You did really good." As the crowd of neighbors began to disperse, offering their final words of encouragement before heading back to their homes, the Johnson family was left standing in the yard, the night air cool around them. The BBQ that had started as a joyful celebration had taken an unexpected turn, but now, as the darkness settled in, there was a quiet sense of unity that had been born from the struggle. Terrence and Angela exchanged a glance, both feeling the same mixture of pride and exhaustion. They had faced down something ugly tonight, something that had been lurking in the shadows for a long time. But they had done it together. And they had done it with grace. Terrence let out a long breath, his body finally relaxing. "Let's get inside," he said, turning to Angela and Ava. "It's been a long day." As they gathered the last of the plates and cups from the yard, Angela glanced over at the street again, her expression troubled. "Do you think the rest of the neighborhood will stay quiet about what happened tonight?" she asked. Terrence shook his head. "I don't think they can stay quiet anymore," he said. "Bill exposed himself. And I think more people are going to speak out now that they know what he really stands for." Angela sighed, hoping he was right. "I just don't want to live in fear," she said softly. "We shouldn't have to." "We won't," Terrence said, his voice steady. "We'll take it one day at a time, and we'll fight back if we have to, but we're not going anywhere." As they headed back into the house, the warmth of their home offering a sense of safety, Terrence locked the door behind them. He turned off the porch light, casting the yard in darkness, and walked over to the living room where Angela was settling Ava onto the couch. The three of them sat together, the weight of the day finally catching up to them. For a few minutes no one spoke, the silence filled only by the soft hum of the ceiling fan and the distant sound of crickets outside. It was a moment of peace after the storm, a chance to catch their breath and hold on to one another. Ava, resting her head on Angela's lap, looked up at her parents with a small smile. "We're going to be okay, right?" she asked. Terrence and Angela exchanged a look, both knowing that the road ahead might not be easy, but they also knew they had something stronger than hate on their side, each other. "Yeah, baby girl," Terrence said, his voice soft but sure, "we're going to be just fine." The next morning dawned quietly, the golden sunlight filtering through the windows of the Johnsons' home. Inside, the house was still, save for the soft sounds of Ava playing quietly in the living room. Terrence and Angela sat together at the kitchen table, sipping their coffee in silence. The events of the previous night still weighed heavily on their minds, but there was a sense of relief that the immediate threat had passed. Angela glanced out the window, her eyes scanning the quiet street. "It feels different today," she said softly, almost to herself. Terrence nodded. He knew what she meant. The air outside felt less tense, less oppressive, as if the confrontation with Bill had shifted something. But he wasn't naive. He knew that one moment of standing up to hate didn't mean it was gone for good. There was still work to be done, still battles to fight. But for now, in this moment, they could breathe a little easier. As they sat in comfortable silence, a knock at the door broke the quiet. Angela looked up, her brow furrowing. Who could that be this early? Terrence stood and walked to the front door, cautiously opening it. To his surprise, a small group of neighbors stood on the porch, Susan, David, and a few others who had witnessed the confrontation the night before. In their hands were baskets of food, trays of pastries, and small bouquets of flowers. "We just wanted to stop by and check on you," Susan said, her voice warm but filled with concern. "We've been talking, and we realized that what happened last night, what Bill did, was unacceptable. We want you to know we don't stand with him. We're your neighbors, and we're here for you." Terrence blinked, momentarily taken aback by the gesture. He hadn't expected such an outpouring of support, especially so soon after the incident. He stepped aside, motioning for them to come in. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "That means a lot." Angela came to the door, her eyes widening as she saw the neighbors entering with their offerings. "What's all this?" she asked, smiling despite the heaviness in her heart. David, carrying a tray of homemade muffins, stepped forward and offered it to Angela. "We just wanted to bring a little something to show our support," he said. "After everything that happened, we thought you could use a reminder that not everyone in this neighborhood feels the way Bill does." Angela took the tray, her eyes misting with tears. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice cracking slightly. "You don't know how much this means to us." Susan placed a hand on Angela's arm, her expression kind but serious. "We're planning to have a neighborhood meeting," she said. "We're going to talk about what happened, and we're going to make it clear that people like Bill aren't welcome here. This is a place for all of us, no matter what we look like. Terrence, standing nearby, felt a surge of hope at Susan's words. He had always believed in the power of community, but seeing it in action like this was something else entirely. For the first time since the confrontation, he felt like maybe, just maybe, things could change. "We'll be there," he said, his voice strong. "Count us in." As the neighbors settled in, sharing stories and words of encouragement, Ava came into the room, her eyes lighting up at the sight of the food. "Are we having breakfast with everyone?" she asked, her voice filled with excitement. Terrence chuckled, scooping her up into his arms. "Looks like it, kiddo," he said, pressing a kiss to her forehead. The morning passed in a blur of conversation, laughter, and a renewed sense of connection. The Johnson family, once feeling isolated and vulnerable, now felt supported by the very people they had feared might stay silent. The neighborhood was coming together in a way that Terrence had always hoped for, but hadn't expected so soon. Later that afternoon, after the neighbors had left and the house was quiet, once again, Terrence and Angela sat together on the porch, watching Ava play in the yard. The sun was warm, and the gentle breeze carried with it the sounds of distant laughter from children playing down the street. Angela leaned her head against Terrence's shoulder, sighing softly. "Do you think things will really change?" she asked, her voice filled with a quiet hope. Terrence was silent for a moment, watching Ava chase a butterfly near the fence. "I think it's a start," he said finally. "We stood up to hate last night. And today our neighbors stood with us. That's more than I could have asked for." Angela nodded, her heart feeling lighter than it had in a long time. "I guess you're right, it's not over, but at least we know we're not alone." Terrence smiled, pulling her closer. "We're never alone," he said quietly. "Not as long as we've got each other. And now it feels like this whole neighborhood is with us too." As they sat together, the warmth of the afternoon sun wrapping around them, they both knew that the fight wasn't over. There would be more challenges ahead, more moments where they would have to stand up for what was right. But for now, in this moment, they were at peace. They had faced down hatred and emerged stronger. And they had done it as a family. Ava ran up to the porch, her face flushed with excitement. "Look, Daddy, I caught a butterfly," she exclaimed, holding her cupped hands out to him. Terrence laughed softly, opening her hands just enough to see the delicate wings fluttering inside. "You did great, sweetie," he said, his heart swelling with pride. Angela smiled, watching their daughter's joy. "You're going to do big things, Ava," she said softly. "Just like you did last night." Ava beamed up at her mother. "I just want everyone to be happy," she said simply. Terrence and Angela exchanged a look, both knowing that their daughter had a gift, a light inside her that could change the world. And in that moment, they knew that no matter what came next, they would face it together. The sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the yard as Ava released the butterfly into the air. It fluttered away, its wings catching the light as it disappeared into the trees. And with it, the weight of the night before seemed to lift, leaving only the promise of better days ahead.